Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I am bringing you the first of 3 top 10 favourite books of 2020 videos. Yes, 3. Normally at the end of the year I just do one top 10 list that has all different kinds of genres and types of books mixed into it that were my top 10 favourite reads of the year, and yesterday when I sat down to try and write that list, I just couldn't do it. I have had an amazing reading year. I have read more books than I've ever read in a year before, and naturally because of that I've read more amazing books than I have in any other year before. So to try and squish all of those amazing books into just a top 10 list, it just didn't work. I wanted to tell you guys about more than 10 books that I loved this year. So today I'm going to be telling you all about my top 10 children's books that I read in 2020, not all necessarily published in 2020, in fact quite a few of these are backlist books. And in the next few days I'm going to be bringing you my top 10 books for fiction for grown-ups and non-fiction as well, so you have those to look forward to. We are going to be looking at a mix of books in this top 10, from books for very young readers up to middle grade and YA. When we're talking about the YA we are going to be talking about sex at points, so you know, be aware. I read so many amazing children's books in 2020, and I think of all of the 3 lists that I've put together, this was the list where there actually were like fantastic books that didn't make the top 10. Like, this was the one that was the most difficult to narrow it down. I have tried to put them in a vague 10 to 1 order, but if you asked me on a different day I would put them in a different order. Anyway, the first book I'm going to talk about is Blood Moon by Lucy Cuthew. I think this is a really fantastic book that went under a lot of people's radars. Like, I don't think it got the hype that it deserved. So this is a YA novel that is told in verse, which I always love, and it is about a teenage girl who has one of her first sexual experiences while she's on her period, and this is all round like a really positive first sexual experience for her. Like, the guy is really chilled about it, they both feel really comfortable, so something which should have been a really lovely, pleasant memory for her is really tainted when her experience becomes a school gossip. There's a lot of shaming around it. It's really interesting to see how the boy that is involved and her are treated differently by the people around them. This book is also about our main character's relationship with her best friend, which is very fraught throughout the book. Both girls in this friendship do things that aren't good, that aren't being a good friend. Like, neither of them is innocent. They are both the guilty party in this conflict, and I think that was done really well, and the book really captured how nasty teenage girls can be to one another. But I think this book also presented a really nuanced depiction of why they behave that way, and why it's actually the patriarchal influences and structures that are around them that make them behave in these ways. The ending of this book is really uplifting. I think if you enjoy the show Sex Education on Netflix, you would love this book. Next I have Greek Myths by Jean Menzies. I will leave Jean's channel linked down below in the description, but I'm sure you're already subscribed to her. This is a beautiful non-fiction book all about Greek myths, and this is also illustrated by Katie Ponder, and I think the relationship between the imagery and the text in this book is done absolutely fantastically. I've always found like all the different figures in mythology quite baffling. Like, I've always really struggled to wrap my head around like who's who and what they're in charge of, who they are in like the family tree, like who they're connected to. So while this book is for children, I think there are huge benefits to reading this as a grown-up reader. The book takes you through a lot of key figures from Greek mythology and key events as well. Something which I thought was fantastically done and really helped me as a reader was the repetition that there is in this book. So it will be explained who a figure from Greek mythology is, and when they come up again later there will be a little like very seamlessly included reminder of who they are, which was really helpful in me like getting everything straight in my head of who was who. And the reading experience of this was just so joyful. I got into bed with it and it was like, it took me back to being a child and being excited to learn things and being so cozy, and it was just the most joyful reading experience. I think this book is really great. Next on the list I have High Rise Mystery. This is a middle grade book that I thought was so much fun. So this is a book that is set on an estate in the UK, and it follows 2 siblings who fancy themselves as detectives. One day a body is found and the 2 kids take it upon themselves to investigate this. Because they've got a different way of thinking, because they've got these inquisitive childlike minds, because they know the estate and because they know that community, they are able to spot things that the grown-ups don't. I think all of the characters in this book were really fantastically crafted, from our main 2 protagonists to all of the side characters. It really brought this estate and community to life. It really captured those kind of quintessential parts of childhood as well. Like, there's a murder that has happened, but it's also really important that these kids get home in time to have their dinner. I thought it was just so much fun. It was a complete joy to read. Next we have Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I enjoyed this book so much and it got me right in the feels. It was a book that I definitely felt a real personal connection to. So this is the second book on this list that is told in verse, and again, that is something that I absolutely love. I think it adds a really interesting and immediate aspect to the storytelling. I feel like it's a lot closer to how people think than writing in just traditional prose. I think it's fantastic, and Elizabeth Acevedo is just the master of this way of telling a story. Again, in this book we are following the relationship between two siblings, but this is quite a different relationship to the one in High Rise Mystery. These two sisters, one living in New York and the other living in Dominican Republic, do not know that the other one exists until their father dies in a plane crash. He normally spends half the year in New York and half the year in Dominican Republic, and these two sisters, they don't know that their dad has a secret family. And when he dies, they find out about this and they have to wrap their heads around both the grief of losing their father, realizing that he kept all of these secrets, and accepting that they now have a sister. One criticism I've heard of this book is that it spends too long without uniting the sisters, and a lot of the book is focused on them grieving individually. But those depictions of grief, the upset and anger that you can feel when you lose a parent, was something that I really connected to. It was something that always just gets me in the feels. And I think the way the author depicted grief was done really fantastically. And there was some queer rep in this book as well, which we are always delighted to see. Next I have Knife Edge by Malorie Blackman. This is the second book in the Knots and Cross series. I've come to this series quite late. I know a lot of people read it when they were younger, when they were teenagers. I only read the first book, Knots and Crosses, last year in 2019. I read this one this year in 2020, and I would love to finish the series next year in 2021 because I think it's one of the best book series that I have ever read. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the concept of the Knots and Cross series, but in this series of books, society is divided into two groups, the Knots and the Crosses. Crosses are black people that have the structural power, and Knots are white people who in this society face a huge amount of racism from the Crosses. In the first book we follow the blossoming relationship between Callum and Sephy. Sephy, who is a wealthy teenage girl, she is a Cross, she has a huge amount of structural power because of who her father is, because of who her family is, and Callum is a very working class Knot, and they just want to be together. They just want to be together, but they can't. I can't really talk too much about Knife Edge specifically because if I do, it spoils Knots and Crosses. But I would say in this book we are really looking at how mixed children are treated, the media's depiction of marginalized groups, and how when you get caught in a cycle of sticking up for yourself and sticking up for your community that then cycles into violence and crime, how difficult it is to get out of that cycle. I think those are the main things we're kind of dealing with in Knife Edge. Absolutely phenomenal series. It is a total page turner. I cannot recommend it enough, and while I do think it's a shame that I didn't read these books as a teenager, I feel so lucky that I can now experience them because I know I have phenomenal books ahead of me for the rest of the series. Next I have Guard Your Heart by Sue Diven. Now this doesn't actually come out until April 2021, but I did read it in 2020. This is a proof copy, of course. So this is a boy meets girl romance that is set on the Northern Irish border. This is on the older end of YA. We are following two, I think, like 17-18 year olds. They've just finished school, and I love books that are in that kind of transitionary summer between being in school and a lot of people going off to college or university. Like, I love books that are set in that little transitionary period. So we're following the romance between Iona and Aidan. Aidan is from a family that are very kind of working class. His family are very much Irish, Catholic, Republican. Iona is essentially from the opposite background as that. Her family consider themselves British, they are Protestant, her brother and her father are in the police. So despite the Troubles, which is the term given to the height of the conflict in Northern Ireland, despite them being over and there being peace, there is still a huge amount of conflict in Derry. And a relationship between Iona and Aidan, whose families both had guns on opposing sides of the conflict, a relationship between these two teenagers, it doesn't seem like it would work. The book follows the conflicts in that relationship, both the kind of small teenage conflicts that there are in a relationship anyway, but also the broader societal conflicts that there is around this relationship. It's a really tense book at points, and it definitely doesn't shy away from the violence. Aidan's perspective of this story was what I found particularly compelling. I think if you enjoyed the TV show Derry Girls, this is definitely a book for you, but also if you enjoyed normal people, especially the class aspects of normal people, then I think you would really enjoy this book. Next I have I Am Thunder by Mohammed Khan. I had never read a Mohammed Khan book before reading this one, even though their writing had been recommended to me so much, but I am so glad that I finally got around to reading it. Oh my god, I Am Thunder was so good. It was unlike any book that I'd ever read before. In this book we are following following a teenage girl named Musna who kind of blends in at her school. She's, I guess, a bit of a wallflower. She does face some prejudice because of being Muslim, but she is fairly kind of unnoticed at her school until the hottest boy in the school takes an interest in her. And gradually, as this book progresses, it becomes clear that his interest in her isn't entirely innocent. In fact, it's very dangerous. I don't want to say too much about the plot other than that, because I think it's something you just need to experience for yourself and let it take you. But this book does deal with radicalization and how that happens, how people can very gradually gain control over another person, particularly someone who is very vulnerable and easily influenced like a teenage girl. If you are a YA reader and you haven't read any of Muhammad Khan's books yet, I would really urge you to. I'm so looking forward to reading the rest of their work. This is really unlike any other YA book that I've ever read. Now into the top 3, but as I said, if you ask me on another day, I might put these books in different orders. But at number 3, I have A Kind of Spark by Elle McNichol. I adored this book so much. This is a middle grade book and our protagonist is autistic, which I think is a perspective that I've not really read much from, especially in this genre, in this kind of target market for middle grade readers. I learned a lot from this book, but I also just thoroughly enjoyed spending time with this character. Her name is Addie, and at school they are learning about witches, and in her town, which is in Edinburgh, or I think it's just outside Edinburgh, there were a number of women who were killed for being witches. And Addie begins to realise that there are kind of parallels between the situation of these women and her own situation, and she realises that maybe if she'd been alive back then, she would have been trialed for being a witch too, because it was essentially anyone that behaved differently to the majority. So Addie thinks that this town should commemorate these women in some way to pay tribute to them and respect their history. So she goes to town meetings and she wants some sort of statue, some sort of plaque to commemorate these witches, and everyone in the town kind of ignores her because they don't like anything that is outside of tradition. They also don't listen to her because she's a girl, they don't listen to her because she's autistic. This is also an amazing book about sisterhood. Addie has 2 older sisters, one of them is also autistic, and we see the struggles she faces as she gets older, but also the ways that she wants to help Addie. Addie's other older sister is a YouTuber, very much in the kind of beauty fashion realm of YouTube, and there's a lot of things about her 2 sisters that she doesn't really understand. I thought the relationships between all 3 of these sisters were done absolutely fantastically. The author manages to squeeze so much into this relatively short book, and also something that I adored about this was the absolute love of books that comes through when you're reading this. Addie is someone who devours books. She loves reading, and I just loved that. I loved how that really shone through this book. It's so good. At number 2, we have The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is another book that is told in verse. In this book, we are following a young black boy from his childhood right the way up to when he goes off to college or university. We see him beginning to understand his sexuality, and when he goes off to university, he becomes interested in drag culture. We look at his relationships with his family, particularly the fraught relationship that he has with his father. The book particularly looks at what it means to be gay and to be black. And while this book definitely didn't stray away from the struggles that young men in this position face, it was ultimately a really uplifting and positive read. I loved the mixed formats in this book. Not only do we have the verse, we have text messages, we have text that is formatted to look like he has torn a page out of his notebook and you can see the poems that he writes. There are illustrations in this book. I love books like that. It's definitely one that I would love to reread. In fact, I think it's a real shame that there are a few books on this list that I don't have physical copies of. I think I would really like to pick one up to add to my children's book collection. And the final book, my absolute favourite children's book of 2020, is a young adult book, and it is Forever by Judy Blume. This book, my god. This book, oh my god. Okay, so there were so many books on this list that I wish were books that had existed when I was a young reader. Representation and inclusion that is long overdue. There are also a few backlist books, like Knife Edge, like the Muhammad Khan book, where I'm like, man, why am I only reading this now? And I think the epitome of the, oh my god, why am I only reading this now, is Forever by Judy Blume. This book was written in the 1970s. Okay, so what is this book actually about? Okay, in this book we are following the relationship between Catherine and Michael. They meet at a party, they are instantly attracted to one another, they get together, and it follows them through their first love, their first sexual experiences, and their first heartbreak. Catherine has a lot of internalized misogyny and shame around sex, even though you know as a reader that she really wants to sleep with Michael. She is so hung up about this idea that good girls don't have sex. And it's really interesting because even the adults around her don't seem to have this attitude, but it's something that she's just really internalized. And I think Michael's frustration with definitely wanting to have sex with Catherine is done really fantastically. Like, it so easily could have been seen as him putting pressure on her or being sleazy or being only after one thing, and it's really not. Like, he's genuinely like frustrated, like he wants to have sex with this girl that he's in love with, and he does vocalize his frustration, and that could come across as not very good, but because you're seeing things from Catherine's perspective and you know that she does actually want to sleep with him, it doesn't come across that way at all. I found this book kind of like academically interesting. Like, in the history of young adult writing, I think this book has just such a powerful place in that history. The heartbreak in this book, got me. It got me so bad. This book is also very funny in places. It really captured the confusion of being a teenager and not knowing what you want. I loved it. I just completely loved it. So there we have it. That is my top 10 children's books of the year. I think for me, it was such a fantastic year, particularly for reading kids books and YA books. I don't know, maybe it was kind of the year that was in it, you know, being back at my parents' house. Maybe I wanted to read lots of kids books. Maybe it was kind of me becoming professionally interested in children's publishing. I don't know. But I just read so many fantastic books. Leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you don't have anything specific to say, leave me a little emoji so I know that you're here. All of the books that I've spoken about will be linked down below in the description so you can find out more about them if you would like. And in a few days, I'm going to be telling you about my top 10 non-fiction books of the year. That's all from me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.